If you live in the real world, you want to hear what Dr. Bruce Rubenstein has to say.
If you live in the spiritual world, you will want to hear what Rabbi Shia Hecht has to say.
We may agree,
And we may disagree.
but you want to hear both views.
So let's get right to it.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Rabbi and the Therapist. Today, we'll be talking about something that this is a word you probably hear a few times a week, maybe even a few times a day. Trauma. Trauma. Doctor, let's start off by first simply explaining what does the word trauma mean, and more importantly, how many people misuse or mischaracterize something that is a happening versus a trauma?
Well, in psychology, we define trauma as something which is outside the realm of normative human experience. So therefore, normative human experience does not include being tortured, being kidnapped, being held at gunpoint, being sexually assaulted. Yeah, that's not normative human behavior.
But having a mother that screams a lot or a father that shouts a lot, is that called trauma?
Or even a parent who physically hurts you, that we put under the category of abuse. And not all abuse is traumatic. Because unfortunately, there is the prevalence, or I should say the incidence of abuse is so widespread that it gets a little tricky to put that under the category of being outside normative human behavior because so many people engage in it. Yes?
Well, I say that the most abused word in the English language is abuse. But let's stick with trauma, and then we will get to abuse, because I think very, very important. And unfortunately, happens more times than not that we think. And particularly kids who are coming out and telling their story, which is another interesting point, and I want to get your take on it as well. So something extraordinary happens to me. Do I have to carry it forward? Is it going to necessarily affect me? If my child goes through something, do I have to throw the kid right away into therapy? Because when they're 15 or 25 or 35 or 55, we're afraid that it's going to reoccur or resurface?
Yeah, well, if you go by the book, we categorize a condition that results from trauma, commonly called post-traumatic stress disorder, but it is very strictly defined by not only the presence of something that is truly traumatic, but rather the effects it has on that individual. So that individual must manifest flashbacks, nightmares, avoidant behaviors. And you can take 100 people who go through a similar traumatic event, and not everyone develops post-traumatic stress disorder. There are certain correlates that predispose that person to developing post-traumatic stress disorder. They're usually characterologic or personality related, but they will not all develop it. You, I'm sure, as I have, met enough survivors of the Holocaust who went on and led very productive lives and did not have what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder, notwithstanding the fact that they went through a trauma. The fact that we're hearing so much about it today, I don't believe is based on the fact that there are quantitatively more traumatic experiences happening across the globe. And in the Western world, I'd even argue that there are less because of the awareness of vulnerabilities and laws and regulations that are in place, which have really curtailed that over decades. I think it has more to do with the proliferation of what we now call the internet and being online, and people going online and feeling as if there is some there's some importance or ethical significance or some benefit to sharing these stories with complete strangers across the world.
My child came home one day and said their best friend unfortunately lost a sibling. And their father, a Rav and a Dayan, insisted that all the children go for therapy. He said, I don't want to hear from nothing. Everybody has to go for therapy. If it's one session or more than one session. What would your opinion be if a trauma clearly happens to a family or to a person? Would you sort of send them off to therapy the first thing?
No, it's not my opinion. We actually know. We call that debriefing. All right. It's essentially having the person talk about the experience in the immediate aftermath of the experience. And it has been definitively shown that that is not only not helpful, but actually potentially counterproductive.
So talking about it sometimes can hurt rather than...
You just leave it alone. You want to normalize the person's life. That's what you want to do. They have in recent years developed a separate category called acute stress reaction, which is essentially manifestations of changes in mood or behavior in the month following a traumatic event, which doesn't necessarily lead to long-term symptoms. If it persists, for more than a month, a year, 2 years, all of that, then we're in the realm of post-traumatic stress disorder. But we certainly learned a lot of this data actually came out post 9/11. Where a lot of the trauma research is done, and in Israel. And this debriefing is counterproductive and actually can make things worse.
It's interesting in halacha, when we talk about the house of mourners, rabbis also, we apply different rules to children of different ages if they lost a father or a sibling. And one of the things we say is every person mourns differently. And therefore, allowing that person to mourn in their way is something very, very important. So at what point do we worry?
Well, I just want to pull back for a second with the example you gave. I don't know that losing a sibling or a parent is a trauma. From dust to dust. I don't know that it's outside the realm of normative human experience.
In other words, we know that people are born and live a certain amount of time.
Correct.
And of course, therefore, it can be a traumatic experience and it can be a normal experience, particularly if your grandmother passed away at the age of 98 years old and she had a little cold. I think we'd say that is somewhat normal. And an overreaction, that's what we would refer to it as, an overreaction from a particular person, maybe, but that alone may mean that the child or grandchild or great-grandchild needs a little bit of counseling, needs a little help.
Yeah. Again, just to pull it back to our original topic, which is trauma. In my own opinion, I don't consider deaths that occur, even if, God forbid, someone's killed in a car accident, but death is a part of life.
Yes.
So
my father used to say, the death is part of living.
Yeah. I don't really put that in the trauma category. If you're talking about extreme examples of how someone died, like the stories we hear from October 7th, that might be a separate, you heard this terrible story of the two children and the grenade, and the father saves them by putting himself over the grenade. We're in a different category there. But I do think that we need to be more rigorous in how we define trauma. And as a secondary point, I think we should be not so accepting of the proliferation of what people consider traumatic stories all over,
So what do you think? We're giving these people a license to therefore fall out of life, be lazy, not deal with responsibilities, not deal with important things that they have to take care of. Is that it?
Well, we can't stop people from videotaping themselves and putting it on Instagram or on YouTube. You can't stop them from
Well, first of all,
doing it.
maybe we can. Now you're talking about something that, I happen to think that in 98% of those cases, they're only concerned about one person only, themselves.
Of course.
Because the damage that they sometimes, why do you have to get up and tell your story in front of the whole world?
Mm-hmm. I think that the idea to do something like that originates actually in the 12-step model for people with addictions, where they go to 12-step meetings and they all stand up and they kind of tell their stories. But that's that's a therapeutic environment where everyone in that room has made a commitment that they will hold whatever they hear confidential. And the purpose of sharing that information is to get feedback from others who have gone through a very similar but very specific experience. That's where I think it started. However, I do not see, to the contrary, I see sharing that, particularly with strangers, when you do it on social media. I think that's going completely the wrong direction. Because if you truly are invested in getting over or getting past something, let's say that was legitimately traumatic, the reflection needs to be inward and not outward. Another example is that there are unfortunately, many therapists who are not very well trained in dealing with this. Clients go to them and they encourage the clients at every single session to just relive it and relive it and relive it. And I see these people decompensate and they end up in the emergency room, making it much worse. That's not the path to healing.
You brought up, there's so many different subjects.
Okay, go for it.
Respond to.
Yeah.
But number one, I've met people who said, and I asked them, why did you do it? Well, my therapist said, I'm going to feel much better. I'm going to get over it. And on the contrary, they just have regret. Why did I get up and tell my story? In most cases, it does not help. It does not make one bit of difference. And like you say, all I added to the bad that have happened, I now have shame above everything else. We know that shame can be sometimes very, very powerful. So first of all, so what do you say if someone says, listen, I think I want to go out and tell my story? And within our own community, I'm going to write the book. I'm going to do that podcast. I'm going to get up there and tell everybody what happened. Mm-hmm. What's the drive?
Well, they'll tell you their drive is I want to help other people. But that, to me, is pseudo chesed, in my opinion. I tell them I think it's a very, very bad idea. And I try to get them focused away from what happened and get them focused on what their values are today and to get busy taking action, formulating goals based on their values, moving forward. The memory will always be there. We can get to it today. We can get to it next year. But if their life is not well-grounded and fulfilled, that certainly is not the time to sit and try to make sense of what is usually, by the way, something that you'll never make sense of. By definition, traumatic events are such that whatever is the cause of it, even if it's a natural disaster like an earthquake, there's no rational reason for it. So to sit there and try to find a rational explanation for an irrational phenomenon is usually quite futile. Interestingly, most of the best research in treatment, the more modern treatments for the people who suffer with the consequences of trauma, come out of Israel. They used what's commonly called ecstasy, gave it to people with post-traumatic stress disorder in a controlled environment, excuse me, in the presence of psychologists. They recently, by the way, tried to get LSD approved by the FDA here in the United States for a similar purpose. But the interesting thing about it is this. What either ecstasy or LSD does is it puts you in a different state of consciousness, which blurs the line between white and black, right, wrong. It just blurs all those lines so that what is clearly a horrific experience somehow has an opportunity to get incorporated in a more universal type of outlook. But even with that, I think it's a bit dangerous. Not all those outcomes are good. And as I said before,
we're going to do a program on that. I think it's not a bit dangerous. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very foolish. And there are many, many horror stories that they're keeping away. But you said something about trauma versus abuse.
Yes.
And does that mean there could be abuse without any trauma? And there too, is there a difference if I want to take revenge against my abuser versus if I want to move on and not talk about my abuser?
Well, one thing you're bringing up, which I didn't mention, is what potentially is the motivation of going public with something like this, and revenge is certainly at play in not a few of these cases. That never ends well.
Right.
By the way, for the person who was traumatized or abused, it never ends well.
Right. And religiously, revenge is one of those things that it doesn't ever end well. We spoke a few weeks ago about letting go. You have to let go and figure it out. And there are many, many different, actually, really programs and formalities of what can be done to help you let go. But revenge is one of the things, like anger and like ga'ava, haughtiness, even a little bit can get you into trouble.
Agreed.
And revenge can drive you to do something that you stop thinking at a certain moment. So from the Torah perspective, that is definitely an area that you don't want to get into.
You don't want to go near. So we have a bit of a continuum. We just have a minute left, but we have this continuum of abuse. And I actually remember when this whole abuse industry started. It was pretty much 1980s. Then that led into trauma, which also became more popularized with 9/11, and then with the proliferation of anyone that can go on the internet, and then you start seeing it everywhere. We need to pull this whole thing back and take a much more critical view of all of this, and stop putting these labels on it and start getting people moving on their path forward and stop reflecting backwards so much.
And I think if we understand that if we pull it in, it's easier to heal yourself if you pull it in rather than if you push it out.
The only way.
Once again, we thank you for listening and joining us for an episode of The Rabbi and the Therapist. Please let your friends know. Please let your neighbors know. For that matter, you can let everybody know that we're here once a week with a new program. If you'd like give us any comments, feedback, we'd love to get that. On the bottom of your screen, you can just let us know what you think, any other questions that you may have. And once again, thanks for listening to The Rabbi and the Therapist.